The oldest city in Europe?
The Beam?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Maybe some city in Italy. Rome?
Athens.
London?
Rome.
I would say Athens.
I think it's in Athens.
Okay, Carnuntum.
Rome.
Was in Vienna.
Bologna.
Rome.
Prague.
I think it's Vienna.
Vienna.
Rome. Probably something nobody would guess.
Plovdiv is the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in Europe and one of the oldest in the world, according to specialists, the fifth or the sixth oldest. Is beside the point, but the only other ones are in the Fertile Crescent. So essentially it's a very old place. No matter where you start digging, you find culture, you find layers and layers of life from times before our own. We actually know the exact map of the Roman city, and we know that, for example, the Roman Stadium, and this is unique, I think, in the world. There's no other case like that. The Roman Stadium runs exactly under the main pedestrian street of the city for 500-600 meters. That's the only reason why we cannot excavate it, because we have to raise down the main streets with the fanciest buildings. And one day probably they'll find a solution to that when they find out how to excavate without having to destroy the buildings on top. No matter where you start restoring or refurbishing a new building, you dig somewhere, you find a Roman grave, you find a mosaic, you find a bath, you find a forum, you find something that belonged to Ottoman, Roman, Thracian, Neolithic times, because the city runs back in time 5,000-6,000 years. When Sofia became the capital, it was substantially smaller than Plovdiv. It's somewhere in the outskirts of Bulgaria, because usually the capital is either on the ocean, on a big river, or in the center of the country, because it has to be, Plovdiv was the perfect location, but the Berlin Treaty split Bulgaria in two, and Plovdiv, which was the most cosmopolitan city at the time, and the most influential city on the entire Balkans, except for Thessaloniki. It was a cultural center, it was a trade center, it stayed in the outskirts. It became the capital of Eastern Rumelia, which was an invented state, because the Berlin Treaty, the big powers were afraid that Bulgaria would be too strong, so they split it in three. And then 7 years later we unified, but the capital was already in Sofia.
During that time, Plovdiv still had its oriental appearance inherited from the Ottoman rule. Open Arts Foundation created a short history booklet about the iconic street Otets Paisiy.
First city planned by Schnitter, and then the street is named number 9 before the names. And after that we started working on what was the street. So this was the end.
която е от османския период. И това е била улицата, просто едни тесни сокаци. Имало е 5-6 джами и няколко обществени бани на тая улица. С улички, които абсолютно тесни, просто ориенталски сокак. Когато започва първия план на Schnitter от 1896, първия план градоустройство, може би от първите години на 20 век започва полека-лека да се изправят улиците, което е било свързано с драматични последствия, защото това са събарени къщи безконтролности. И чак към 20-те години на 20 век започват улиците да се павират. Улица, която се е свързвала с модерността. Тоест, тук започват първите големи представителства на големите фирми, които тогава влизат в България. Siemens, Telefunken, Mercedes, Benz, Chrysler, шевни машини на Лисингер. Тук е улица, на която се намират представителствата на най-големите фирми, AEG, които създават един модерен вид.
One of the most prominent industrialists in Plovdiv was the tobacco trader and philanthropist Dimitar Kudoglu. At the beginning of the 20th century, he modernized a large part of the city center, creating infrastructure and initiating activities for commercial as well as public and charitable purposes. With the advent of communism, however, the legacy of such progressive entrepreneurs such as Kudoglu got neglected, and thus the economic significance of Plovdiv began to weaken.
Back in communist times, the whole centralization concept was very strong. But it turned out that after the democratic changes, the situation was enhanced, it was aggravated. We expected the opposite to happen and that the provinces would kind of balance off the capital, but no. Actually, under communism, I think the part of GDP that came from Sofia was like 12%, and then it increased to over 30%. So centralization became huge and overpowering.
Nevertheless, Plovdiv retains the charm of its post-liberation renaissance, adding yet another chapter to its rich historical heritage.
If you look at those buildings in the main square or any of the older buildings from the 20s and 30s, you can see that people had a feeling for it's not just about practicality, it's not just about inhabiting a space, it's also about creativity, about the soul of living. You know, you have those ornaments, you have those atlases on top of the buildings, you have those weird towers that are completely useless but so beautiful and wonderful, and they create dynamics in the city. So people did things with taste and with care about how you touch the senses. Probably because they realized that this is a city that always touches the senses, and that no matter where you go, it touches your senses. Look at those stones over there. They're not like any ordinary stones. Those are probably either from Ottoman times, and some of them are probably from Byzantine times. These stones in the goddamn wall just opposite to us.
The idea was to talk about the dignity of the person without talking about the age. To make link between the older Plovdivians that have memories, ideas on history and the past, and the new younger people that are living here on the street, to make this link and to have this link of curiosity between them. So there is no age, and Plovdiv is not a city that can age.